It's the All Things Strange podcast. I am your host, Agent Anderson. Come along as we examine UFO sightings, conspiracies, and all things strange. You can find all of our wonderful links in the description on the Linktree, where you can find our Patreon, our Discord, our merchandise, and more. This week's episode, the Havana Syndrome. Before we get started, we've got two wonderful tiers of Patreon for you. The first tier will get you after hours when applicable, bonus episodes, and early access. The second tier will get you the ability to vote on upcoming topics such as this one. This time around, the opposing vote was the 2004 Nimitz Tic Tac kind of a deal, but the listeners chose the Havana Syndrome. I'm guessing because the Tic Tac UFO has been done to death, and probably we don't need a whole lot more coverage on it, even though, believe it or not, there are still things unfolding with those UFO events. But anyways, one thing led to another. Here we are, and we are doing the Havana Syndrome this week. The Havana Syndrome, also known as anomalous health incidents. This was first reported in Havana, Cuba, hence the name, in late 2016. The press started reporting on it in 2017, and that's when we kind of found out about it. It's kind of controversial. There are a lot of people who think that it's not even a real thing at all, but we'll get to that later. So in 2016 and 2017, Americans and Canadians at their embassies in Havana, Cuba, were reporting strange occurrences. They would hear a noise that sounded annoying and came from a specific direction. And they would also feel a pressure from that direction and would have various symptoms such as severe headaches, dizziness, blurred vision, tinnitus, vertigo, memory loss, blindness on the side where they felt the pressure, and many more. The symptoms were short-term for some people and long-term for others. These attacks would happen sometimes just once, but many people felt them multiple times. Or attacks, did I say attack? Maybe it was an attack. It could have just been crickets. I don't know. Who knows? The total number of people affected overall is unknown, but it's believed to be between 1,000 and 2,000 people, but it could be more. We don't really know. And this has been investigated by many entities, including the State Department, the University of Pennsylvania, the FBI, the CDC, the DOD, the DIA, ODNI, journalists, and on and on and on. This has been a lot of people have looked into this, so it's something that they, at the very least, took seriously. Also, there have been allegations by victims of a cover-up of the Havana Syndrome, of what had happened to them. Various government agencies have denied its existence, and they have ignored evidence and witness claims. We don't know why it would be covered up, but the reasons could be related to diplomacy, or maybe they didn't want to pay out on medical claims, or perhaps it's easier to just sweep it under the rug and not deal with it, rather than have to actually open an investigation. So, in other words, the lazy excuse. Alternately, perhaps they did deal with it and try to catch the perpetrators, but did so in secret so as to not reveal any covert operations or top secret methods or goings on. So that's why they might have covered it up. We'll get to a couple of specific cases later, but in some cases, there were people who had long-lasting chronic symptoms from this, and those people were not given medical treatment. They had to pay out of pocket to be treated because the government said that it didn't really happen. So as I said, this all started more or less in 2016 and 2017 in Havana, Cuba. There are a couple of cases earlier than that, but that's like the main event. By mid-2018, there were 26 Americans who had come forward reporting the strange sounds and symptoms. They first reported a strange noise that was hard to describe, described variously as metallic or grating or annoying, loud, and the noise came from a specific direction. They felt pressure and vibrations from that direction as well. And most people reported that whatever it was lasted 20 to 30 seconds. The people being or experiencing this event were sometimes near other people, and they would ask those other people, do you feel this? Do you hear this? And those other people indicated that they didn't feel any pressure, they didn't get the symptoms, and they didn't hear the noise, which would indicate that whatever this is or was highly directional. It was not a large area where you just sort of spread it around, whatever causes it, and it affects multiple people. It's targeted. In 2017, the State Department said the mysterious events were either an attack or due to exposure to an unknown device. They didn't blame anybody in particular, but they said they suspected a sonic weapon and possibly infrasound. So ultrasound would be frequencies higher than what we can hear, and infrasound are those frequencies lower than what we can hear. And the famous example of infrasound is the legendary Brown note, which I've looked into, and I haven't found any evidence that that's actually a thing. It appears to be an urban myth, although, a hilarious one. Imagine if you're walking down the street and somebody could zap you with a speaker and make you poop your pants. Crazy stuff. All right, in August 2017, the United States expelled 2 Cuban diplomats as the mysterious events continued. They believed that their people in Cuba were being attacked, and they did this in retaliation to the attacks. In September, the State Department began removing non-essential staff and told U.S. citizens to stay out of Cuba. So they were running their embassy on a skeleton crew. In October 2017, President Trump said that Cuba was responsible for the attacks. That's a public statement, and the president saying that a foreign country is attacking our citizens is kind of a big deal. I don't think I need to point that out, but I just did. In March 2018, Canadian diplomats stationed in Cuba traveled to Pittsburgh to see a doctor that had helped other victims of the strange attacks. Neurologists there found evidence of brain damage in both Canadian and American personnel. Some Canadians had symptoms so severe that they could no longer continue working at the embassy. They had to quit their jobs. They were so sick they couldn't work. Global Affairs Canada ended family postings in Cuba in early 2018. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but it wasn't just diplomats being attacked, it was also their family, including children. Also in 2017 and 2018, there were more attacks in other parts of the world. Moscow, Poland, Taiwan, Australia, Austria, Uzbekistan, Colombia, and more. Those are just a handful of, this stuff was happening all over the world, suggesting that probably it wasn't Cuba. In 2019, there were even White House employees who experienced the Havana Syndrome in Washington, D.C. 2 American diplomats experienced it in 2021 in Hanoi, Vietnam. Also in 2021, in Vienna, dozens of people from the United States from different agencies were attacked, along with their families. Vienna had the second most number of victims after Cuba. So you have these isolated attacks around the world where it might just be a few people, But in Cuba and in Vienna, you have these clusters where dozens or even hundreds of people experienced whatever this was. There were a couple of other attacks, or whatever, I guess we'll call it an attack because that's what it seems like it is, in 2021 in Berlin, Serbia, and Colombia, and a couple of other places. At first, at this point, they thought it was a device emitting sound, such as, quote, intermodulation distortion from multiple signals, perhaps some malfunctioning Cuban surveillance equipment that wasn't supposed to be doing this. So it was an accident. There were, as I said, there were many investigations. Let's talk about just a handful of them here. In 2018, the FBI released a report that said there was no evidence of a sonic attack or involvement of foreign agents. Okay, so you have, I don't know how many at this point, at least dozens of people who are reporting symptoms and events, and the FBI basically said, it's not a real thing. Don't worry about it, guys. It's just fake. It's made up. Fake news. A second FBI report in 2018 by a different department in the FBI said that it was probably just mass hysteria. And this second investigation did not actually interview any of the witnesses. That's not weird, right? That's normal to do an investigation. And even though you have access to the witnesses, you're not going to bother talking to them. Okay, that's interesting. That looks like a cover-up to me. If the FBI issues a report, people are generally going to believe it. Pretty strange stuff. And those two reports, all of these reports I'm going to talk about, they're generally available online. Some of them are classified and redacted, but you can find a lot more details of these reports, but I'm doing like the short version because I figured it would be a little too far afield to actually go through specific reports and read excerpts from them and all that stuff. So this is just kind of a summary, but you can definitely find more information about a lot of this stuff. The University of Pennsylvania studied 21 Havana victims, and they, quote, found no evidence of white matter tract abnormalities, but they did find symptoms that they believed were similar to a concussion. And that was really puzzling because none of these people had experienced any sort of head trauma, but they had symptoms of a concussion. Concussions don't just happen spontaneously, so that was a little puzzling. Quote, the diplomats appear to have sustained injury to widespread brain networks. So in order to cause these symptoms, you would have to have multiple parts of the brain injured. You wouldn't just have a bump on, one part of your forehead. Pretty scary stuff. So their brains apparently were being affected. The main author of the University of Penn study, Douglas Smith, thought that electromagnetic radiation of the microwave wavelength were probably the main suspect, and Beatrice Alexandra Golomb concluded that the symptoms were consistent with exposure to pulsed FR microwave radiation. So that's kind of interesting. Pulsed would have a different effect than just a straight signal, I guess. I'm not sure. The University of Pennsylvania study was definitely controversial. There was lots of criticism and backlash. For instance, they didn't have a control group, which I thought was kind of strange. Now, I might be a little bit confused about how science works, but I'm not sure how you could actually run an experiment and have a control group where people are getting their brains scrambled. I'm not sure how that would work, but nonetheless, this is a controversial study, so if you're curious to read up on that more, then there's definitely lots of information available. JASON, a group of scientists that advise the U.S. government, I had to look this up because I wasn't really familiar with this group. JASON, that's a strange name for a group, and there are different reasons as to why it might be named that, and that's a whole subtopic of itself, so we'll leave that alone. If you're curious, Google it, JASON. This group was created after Sputnik was launched. That event was a bit of a surprise. So they created this group of scientists to advise the government. Anyways, they analyzed 8 audio recordings and 2 videos from the original 21 Havana victims, and parts of this report were declassified in 2021. They concluded that the audio recordings were caused by insects, and it was unlikely that microwaves or other directed energy weapons were involved. Quote, no plausible single source of energy can produce both the recorded audio signals and the reported medical effects. Kind of weird. So they're saying all of these people are experiencing this stuff, but there's no plausible source that could cause this. We don't know about it. So therefore it doesn't exist because we're not aware of it. Pretty strange stuff, right? These scientists are kind of weird sometimes. If they're not, you can look at the history of science and there are some cases like this. My favorite being the denial that, microorganisms or bacteria or whatever were a real thing. There was a lot of resistance to that for a number of years. But I don't know, that's a whole other topic, so we'll leave that one alone. I mean, not to criticize science. It just seems, I don't know, it seems silly. I guess scientists are people too, right? And they'll have their egos just like anybody else. All right, so this report, I couldn't find the recordings that they used to analyze, but they said it was basically crickets. All right. But to be fair, so my thoughts on saying that it's just cricket noise, okay, maybe. I did find a recording of the sound elsewhere. I heard it in a 60 Minutes interview. And I did also play the Havana Syndrome sound in a previous episode where I talked about strange sounds. And I don't think I need to revisit that. It's not very pleasant to listen to. If you want to listen to it, you can Google it for yourself. But it occurred to me, like, what kind of cricket is directional? The ones that I've heard fill space. They're the exact opposite of directional. You can't really tell where it's coming from. It echoes off of everything, and it's hard to tell the direction, especially if you're in an area with a lot of surfaces to reflect sound. If you're in an area where there aren't a whole lot of trees or bushes or anything, then sure, you can tell where it's coming from. But if you're in the woods at night or something, forget about it. Also, cricket sounds don't cause pressure on your face from a specific direction. And also, if one person hears the crickets, so do other people next to that person or in the same area. But to be fair, the scientists said, quote, it cannot be ruled out that while the perceived sounds, while not harmful, are introduced by an adversary as deception, so as to mask an entirely unrelated mode of causing illness. I suppose it's possible to beam sound waves at the person as well as directed, energy weapons or radiation or whatever. I suppose that is possible, but why would they do that? Wouldn't a silent weapon be better? Because if you're directing a sound at somebody that they find uncomfortable, wouldn't it make it easier for these victims to just run away and hide? Also, I have reservations about this because many, many witnesses were victimized or they experienced this while indoors, and I think it would be difficult to beam directional sound waves through a wall. That's not really how sound waves work. If they had some kind of a beam and they also used sound at the same time, maybe they could hit the window, and then the window can actually act as sort of a speaker and vibrate and transmit the sound into the room. Also, the walls can do the same thing, but then it wouldn't be directional. The sound would fill the room. Interesting little side note, by the way. I once read about a device that they can use to hear a conversation inside of a room. They basically point a laser at the window, and the window vibrates from the noises inside the room so they can actually hear what's going on inside the room. Isn't that crazy? Wild stuff. What will they think of next? Anyways, this particular report is interesting that they concluded, based on actual recordings of the events in Havana, some of the victims recorded the sound. It's interesting that they said that it was crickets, but it leaves a lot of questions unanswered. In 2019, Robert Bartholomew and Robert Below wrote a paper concluding that it was all just basically mass hysteria. That's not really the terminology they used, but that's what they mean. It's all just psychological. Did they actually believe this? Were they part of a cover-up? Did they later publish a book to sell, to make money on? I don't know, maybe some of those things are true. In 2019, the CDC released a report that concluded, quote, "The evaluations conducted thus far have not identified a mechanism of injury, process of exposure, effective treatment, or mitigating factor for the unexplained cluster of symptoms experienced by those stationed in Havana." Basically, the CDC was saying, we have no idea what's happening here, and we have no answers for you. The DoD became concerned in 2020. Christopher Miller, the defense secretary, said, quote, "I knew the CIA and Department of State were not taking this shit seriously, and we wanted to shame them into it by establishing our task force." So in other words, this quote is really quite shocking. You don't see this kind of stuff too often. They will usually keep criticisms between departments behind closed doors. You don't really see these sorts of things aired publicly. But I imagine Christopher Miller was becoming extremely frustrated at the lack of concern over these attacks. I can understand it to an extent. Imagine you're managing some government office. Who knows what it is? Could be the DMV, could be, I don't know, an embassy, whatever it is. And your employee comes to you and says, "Well, I was walking my dog and I started to feel really dizzy all of a sudden. I heard this strange noise and now I'm having severe headaches." Well, it sounds really weird, and to be honest, it doesn't really sound all that believable if it was an isolated case. But since you have dozens of people coming forward with very similar reports, at some point it boggles the mind that certain people weren't taking this more seriously. Anyways, Christopher Miller wanted to shame them, and shame them he did. The CIA started their own task force also in 2020. The National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine released a report in late 2020, I think in December. They said there wasn't strong evidence, but directed radio frequency, toxic chemicals, infectious diseases, and mass hysteria were the most likely candidates. Again, they did not use the term mass hysteria. That is not a scientific term, not really. They used other terminology, but that's basically what they meant. They said it was psychological. They thought that chemicals and infectious diseases were less likely because it would be impossible for chemicals or infectious diseases to cause the symptoms that were being reported. But they felt that psychological reasons or directed energy weapons could cause the symptoms being reported. They found that the symptoms were consistent with exposure to radio frequency energy or some kind of electromagnetic radiation. They also stated, though, that psychological causes were unlikely to cause the acute chronic auditory and vestibular symptoms. So they're kind of saying that it's possible that some people really did experience this, and some people are having psychological reactions to those people. And just imagine, I mean, word gets around, right? Just imagine you're working in an office, you're sitting in your cubicle, and let's say 5% of the people that work at that office are experiencing this. that would make me super paranoid. I would be freaking out every time I went out to lunch or, when I went home, if I got a headache, which headaches are extremely common. Let's say I heard some crickets and I got a headache. Well, I might start to think that I was attacked as well. I understand the psychological aspect of this because I think people can sometimes psych themselves up. On the other hand, uh, they're saying that can't cause the acute chronic symptoms. So it's, kind of a mixed bag. In 2020, the New York Times reported that a 2014 NSA report said that a hostile nation possessed a microwave weapon that could be aimed at someone in their bedroom and that it could cause nervous system damage. The report also said that Russia wanted to disrupt cooperation between the United States, China, and Cuba. Some of the people affected in China and Cuba were specifically working to bring about better relations and cooperation between the countries. And that's exactly what happened, right? The people stationed in Cuba were attacked. The United States government had a knee-jerk reaction and blamed Cuba. That's a reasonable assumption to make, that they're being attacked by Cubans in Cuba, and that deteriorated relations between Cuba and the United States. That makes a lot of sense. In 2020, oh, by the way, this report and the 2014 MSA report, that's like a whole subtopic that you go down the rabbit hole if you're interested in. But there's a lot I want to talk about here, so we don't have time for that particular rabbit hole, or a lot of rabbit holes. But this topic, the Havana Syndrome, there's really a lot of rabbit holes to go down for this particular one. You could spend a lot of time researching this one. In 2021, the New Yorker reported that unnamed officials in government believed that Russian agents were aiming microwave devices at U.S. officials to steal information from their phones and computers. Apparently, there are devices that can be aimed at electronics, such as phones, and they can get data from those devices. How does that work? I don't know, but apparently it's a thing. So these devices would be used from a car, most likely. Some of them may be small enough to fit into a backpack and could be used by somebody on foot, but that would probably be more obvious. This basic idea is that they weren't trying to harm the people specifically. They were trying to steal information from their devices. However, I don't think that this was just a side effect. When you look at specific cases of what happened, many of the people attacked did not even have an electronic device anywhere near them. So they wouldn't have been zapped by microwaves to steal data from their electronic device. I don't know. So that's an interesting idea, but it doesn't really check out. In 2022, the Director of National Intelligence released a report that said 4 core symptoms could be caused by electromagnetic radiation, and that other symptoms could be due to psychological factors. So, kind of, once again, a mixed bag, just like the other report I talked about. And that made me wonder, why would you mix a bag? What are you mixing it with? Other bags? I don't know. Okay, stupid dad joke. In 2022, the CIA released a report that studied 1,000 cases. They said it was unlikely to be caused by a foreign power. Oh, really? Well, then who's causing it? All right, so is that the CIA admitting it was them? I don't know. Come on, guys. All right, let's get to that. That's just like the overview. Let's get to some specific cases of, people who were affected by this. Now, like I said, it wasn't just officials that were targeted. It was also people's families, including children. Mark Lindsay worked at this as a State Department security guard in China. He heard a sound that he described as a marble going down a funnel. And as it get to, when it gets to the smaller part and it speeds up, he said that's kind of like what it sounded like, but that's the closest he can get to describing it, but it was a unique sound unlike anything he had ever heard. But it was very loud, and he heard it 3 to 4 times, always by his son's crib and always at bedtime. He experienced light sensitivity, short-term memory loss, and headaches. He believes he was targeted because he used top secret equipment for diplomatic missions. Now, unfortunately, in a lot of these interviews, these people were doing sensitive things that are classified, so they couldn't exactly say what they were doing, the tools they were using, whatever. So a lot of this is kind of vague. But these people seem credible, and there are some pretty important people that have gone on record for this topic. Anyways, back to Mark Lindsay. He believes that the attack was directional because there was also, his neighbor, Catherine Warner, was also attacked. But Mark, because of the way he experienced it near the crib and only in a specific spot, he believes that it was directional. Catherine Warner, who was a U.S. Commerce Department trade officer, and his neighbor also was attacked or experienced these strange events. Her job working in China was to promote U.S. business from the consulate. And again, we have somebody who's working to improve relations between China and the United States being, attacked, really. She said she could feel the sound in her head and felt an intense pressure on both of her temples, so this one was less directional. She also felt pain and heard a low oscillating humming sound. She looked around for the sound, but could not find any source. She got hives all over her body really badly. Is that a coincidence? Could it be related to this event? Perhaps she was exposed to something that gave her the hives, some kind of allergen or chemical, in addition to whatever this directed energy thing is. So she experienced, after a couple of attacks, she experienced intense headaches, severe fatigue, nausea, and nosebleeds, and her dogs were apparently also affected. They began throwing up blood. Not the dogs. Come on, man. Leave the dogs out of it. They don't know anything about international stuff. They're just dogs. She wasn't super aware of the Cuba event. She had kind of heard of it, but she didn't really know the details. She just kind of was vaguely aware of them, probably seeing something on the news, but she did not connect what was happening to her to what was happening in Cuba. She became so ill that she asked her mother to come and live with her and take care of her, and her mom was there for 3 months helping her live. She had really had trouble. The mother also was attacked and got sick with the same symptoms: headaches, ringing in her ears, memory problems, etc. Werner at one point was evacuated to the United States after her symptoms became too severe for her to continue working. Here's a quote from the NSA. High-powered microwave system weapon that may have the ability to weaken, intimidate, or kill an enemy over time without leaving evidence. This weapon is designed to bathe a target's living quarters in microwaves. That quote was from an NSA employee's workers' comp case, a guy named Mike Beck. So that's an actual NSA document, and they appear to be saying that this weapon actually injured somebody. The interesting thing about Mike Beck's case is that his case was all the way back in the 1990s. He was on assignment overseas and working with a partner. Interestingly, he and his partner both developed Parkinson's disease at the same time. That is extremely unlikely to happen. Possible, but unlikely. His partner was named Chuck Bett, and they were working in a quote hostile country in 1996 for 1 week. He couldn't say which country or what he was doing there, but he believes he was attacked by the Havana Syndrome weapon. He can't really discuss any details because they're classified, unfortunately. Robin Garfield and his wife and 2 children were posted in Shanghai. They also experienced the Havana Syndrome for months. His wife described being hit by something from her left side that felt like an electric shock that left her feeling paralyzed and unable to move, or I guess during the attack. That's how she felt. The kids suffered blurred vision and loss of balance and had trouble speaking, like they couldn't find the words, like short-term memory loss. And they had such trouble with their balance that they would just fall over while walking. Robin was told that his symptoms were from an old baseball injury from years before the attacks. But of course, this doesn't explain the symptoms that his family suffered. And that's there's a lot. I mean, I could do a whole episode focusing just on the cover-up element of this, but he and his family were very clearly having odd symptoms, and those couldn't be explained by his injury. They couldn't be explained because his kids weren't using electronic devices when they were attacked, so on and so forth. It's a weird thing, and it appears that his family was attacked in addition to himself, almost to try to get at him, I guess. Interestingly enough, the DoD, the Department of Defense, covered up stuff in China, but not in Cuba. Why is that? Financial reasons, political reasons. They didn't want to cover the medical bills. Probably they didn't want to endanger relations with China. China's a very powerful country, and it's in our best interest to not go around pointing fingers at them. Cuba, I mean, they have no power at all. So we can point fingers at them all we want. There's nothing they can do to us. They're not an important trade partner. We don't really need them for any particular reason. They're just kind of there near Florida, I suppose that we don't want enemies stationed there, but I don't know. It's a different thing dealing with China and Cuba. So maybe that's why they ignored or covered up the attacks in China, but not in Cuba. Anyways, since they determined that determined that Robin's injuries were from a baseball incident years prior and not something happening in China, his injuries were not covered by medical insurance. He said that his injuries were pre-existing and they weren't going to pay for his treatment. So he had to pay out of pocket for treatment for him and his family, and I can imagine that would be extremely expensive. So he went back to Philadelphia, and while being treated in Philadelphia, he and his family were attacked again at their home. They moved out to a hotel and were attacked again in the hotel. When he went to check on the kids in the other room, he saw them thrashing in their sleep. And when he put his head near his children's head, he heard the sound. He said it sounded similar to water rushing. He picked up his kid and moved them, both the kids, and moved them out of their room. Now, once again, we have evidence that this is a directional attack, not something that would paint an entire room or fill an entire room or whatever, but something highly, highly directional. And I was wondering, okay, how could you even tell where somebody was in a room? You could probably use infrared or something to see exactly where somebody was, and that would make it real easy to target them, especially if they were in their sleep. Robin believed that they were attacked by somebody staying in the hotel room above theirs, or perhaps below. That's pretty frightening. So that means that there was somebody or a team of people following him around to attack him with whatever this was. All four of the family members had the same chronic symptoms: trouble with memory, trouble speaking, bad vision, bad balance, headaches, the whole 9 yards. Olivia Troy, who was the Homeland Security and Counterterrorism Advisor to Vice President Pence, served in Iraq. She served in the Pentagon, the DIA. Really quite the impressive resume. Anyways, she worked in the office building next to the West Wing of the White House. And in the summer of 2019, while she was walking down the stairs in the front of the building, she felt like she was physically struck by something. She felt a piercing something on the right side of her head and got vertigo, got nauseous, disoriented. She felt off balance. She felt like she was having a panic attack, and she grabbed the rail for balance. This is extremely alarming because this building is right next to the White House and it's in like a secured area. Nobody can get in. Like, you can't just walk up to this building. It's fenced off. You need permission to get into this area. So that indicates that whatever this is most likely being used from a range, a few hundred yards away, and then they can reach that far to attack somebody. It might also indicate that these devices are small enough to smuggle in to the area. Maybe you could fit something in your pocket. Perhaps it could be disguised as a cell phone. I think that's probably less likely than something that is long range. About a year later, she had the same experience a few times while walking to her car from the office building next to the White House. She felt disoriented and said she couldn't tell where the ground was. She didn't report these attacks at first because she said she was basically in denial and she didn't want to endanger her career. And I can understand that. If you're walking around and you start feeling dizzy, you might tell yourself, no, I'm fine. It's just, it's just a spell. I'm just feeling off today. Maybe I'm a little bit sick. I could definitely see that. But after it happened several times, she became concerned and eventually reported it. Another individual who is anonymous, but also working in the government, was attacked on the same steps of that building near the West Wing. He told his story to John Bolton, who is a well-known attorney, diplomat, consultant, national security advisor, among many other government positions. He's been working in the government for decades. If you're aware of U.S. politics, then you'll know who this guy is. If not, just suffice to say that he is a high-ranking official in the government on the Republican side of the aisle. Anyways, the anonymous official had similar symptoms that lasted for more than a year. They said that, quote, I'm still recovering and suffering from headaches and other symptoms, and have been diagnosed with 2 other medical conditions that are believed to be the result of the attack, as I had no prior history of them. I am still continuing medical care from Walter Reed, that's a hospital, which the DoD has granted until the end of the spring. I am immensely grateful to the doctors and medical staff at Walter Reed and the DoD staff who helped arrange for my care and the others who have been attacked. They've been enormously helpful, and it is slowly helping me get back on track, although I still do not feel like my normal self. And that's from a document they had. This interview I saw on the 60 Minutes episode. There's a couple of 60 Minutes episodes about this. If you want to see these people and hear it in their own words, I would definitely recommend checking that out. And John Bolton actually was on that episode, so this is not like a friend of a friend of a friend kind of a thing. This is actually stuff that John Bolton said, and this is a document that they showed on the TV screen, and I had to pause it to read what it said, because they only put a shorter quote from that. They didn't read the whole document. They just had it on the screen. John Bolton says that the attack was very debilitating to this person. Miles Taylor, Chief of Staff for the Department of Homeland Security was attacked late night in April 2019, just after being appointed to that position. He woke in his apartment in Washington, D.C., near Capitol Hill. That's what they call the area where, the government is. They, for the listeners, there are a lot of people who listen to this podcast who may not be aware of certain things in the United States politics. I mean, heck, I don't know what they would call the government building in Australia. I just don't have that depth of knowledge of other nations. So I assume that international listeners also don't have that depth of knowledge. So if you are a domestic United States listener, that's why I sometimes explain these terms so that our international listeners can understand what the heck I'm talking about. They may not know what Capitol Hill is or Washington, D.C., or any of that stuff. I don't know. Anyways, Miles Taylor heard a chirping sound like a digital cricket, is how he described it. He went to the window, opened up the window, and looked down at the street this is 3:30 in the morning. He saw a white van that was running, and he knew it was running because its brake lights were on. When he looked out, it sped off, and the total time of this episode lasted 7 to 10 minutes. The next day, he felt sick, he felt off, he didn't really want to go into work. I'm sure he did anyways because, first day and all, right? You got to make a good impression. He was attacked again 5 weeks later. He felt off balance and he felt like he had a concussion. He was supposed to go to Israel just before the attacks to talk to the government there. So we're starting to see a pattern. People who are doing important diplomatic missions are being attacked. And he was supposed to talk to high-level people in the Israeli government, including Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the guy in charge of everything. So this was not just some small, dignitary that doesn't really have any power or some small government official that doesn't have any power. He was talking to some important people. He also knows somebody, quote, roughly at the cabinet level. He won't be more specific than that, but the cabinet level, the cabinet is appointed by the president, and those are the people who are in charge of everything. So that's pretty much as high level as you can get without being a president or a senator or a Supreme Justice. I mean, that's really as high as you get in the government, pretty much. So he knows a person who was attacked but wants to stay anonymous. That person was attacked by the weapon, and they said that it set off a 5-alarm fire in his head. So Miles Taylor. So when Miles Taylor spoke to this person, he said it set off a 5-alarm fire in his head. That's a way of saying, it really caught his attention because this was basically his job at the Department of Homeland Security to prevent this kind of stuff or to deal with it when it happens. Now, when the lower ranking officials had this happened working in, Havana or China, those people had a much harder time being taken seriously. But when this happens to somebody who's cabinet level, they take it seriously. It's kind of frustrating, right? Only some people matter. A lot of people don't matter to the government. And that's kind of sad because the government is there to serve us. But those people in the government, it's kind of like we have an aristocracy, right? We have royalty, and some people are part of this royal class. The rest of us are not. It sucks. Especially when you're dealing with injuries and, effects from these things. But anyways, I thought that was interesting that he said cabinet level, and he was being very vague during the interview. There really is not, maybe a general in the military. I don't know. There's not really the cabinet level people don't really have peers, right? There's not like a whole lot of people who are at that level. So possibly this was somebody who was actually in the cabinet, but they just don't want to come out publicly and say who they were for whatever reason. John Bolton himself, who I mentioned earlier, went to London on official business, and 2 members of his staff were attacked in a hotel. Starting to see a pattern emerge here. They had the whole floor of the hotel. I guess probably for security reasons or whatever, they rented out the whole floor. My tax dollars at work, that's exciting. And Bolton himself believes 100% that this was actually an attack on his personnel. He doesn't think that it was psychological or any other cause. One of those 2 people was attacked again a few months later while walking her dog in Washington, D.C. Once again, the seat of power, Washington, D.C., that's where our federal government resides. They were attacked there. It's very concerning that you have multiple attacks in Washington, D.C. You would think it would be harder to attack high-ranking officials in the government, like there would be some kind of security protecting them, but that appears to not be the case. However, Washington, D.C. it's a city, kind of like New York or something. Like there's a lot of buildings there. There's a lot of people that live there. There's a lot of traffic all the time. So if you had a weapon that could fit in a backpack or that could be used from a moving vehicle or whatever, it could be extremely difficult to detect those weapons and prevent those attacks. There's an anonymous witness from Cuba who had severe ear pain, crushing feeling on the head. They were having problems with blacking out. They got blindness in one of their eyes. The eye was examined by a doctor. The eye works correctly, so the eye responds to light as it's supposed to, and it moves around and all that stuff. But it's like the connection to the brain got severed or something, like there's nerve damage. They also had balance issues. And here's a quote from this individual. Quote, "People are going to Cuba and coming back a shell of their former selves." This person was interviewed on 60 Minutes, although he didn't say his name, which I found strange. There were a couple people on 60 Minutes who said, I don't want to say my name, but I'm going to go on in front of camera. I mean, if you see them on the camera, it's probably not all that hard to identify them. However, I guess when you're doing that quote unquote anonymously, you're not speaking on the record as a government official. You're just a nameless person on a TV show. So maybe that's why they did it. I don't know. They don't want to catch crap from the CIA or whatever. But yeah, that particular person from the Cuba incident didn't say their name, didn't say their job, but they were on 60 Minutes. Bill Burns, who was the director of the CIA at one point, among many other high positions, met with dozens and dozens of affected people, and he found their stories and symptoms convincing. And while he was on a visit to India, a member of his staff was attacked. That's the basic rundown of the Havana Syndrome. There are a lot of topics you could delve into. There was a witness when they were attacked. They looked down in the alleyway and they saw a man who was looked like a Russian agent. They're not 100% sure. There's a lot of stories. There's a lot that I didn't cover, but I think I covered basically, just to give you a basic overview of the whole thing. But man, this one, there's a lot to this topic. So if you're curious, I recommend checking out some more information. There's a ton of resources online. There's some interviews you can find, and you can even find a recording of the sound if you really want to hear it. But all right, so what are some explanations? What could this all be? The Havana Syndrome. What is it? Obviously, we talked about a lot of the stuff during the show. Interestingly, the sound itself appears to be a side effect of whatever's happening and not the actual cause of the damage, because sound cannot cause these physical effects that are happening. They just can't. Sound cannot give you a concussion, and a lot of the symptoms are very similar to a concussion. So the skeptical explanation is nothing at all. These aren't real attacks. These people are just stressed out. Maybe they're hungover. Maybe they have allergies, stuff like that. It's all just imaginary. If it really was some kind of top secret weapon, then it would be more effective and it would have been used on high-level people, not just low-ranking officials. These are not my arguments. These are arguments that skeptical people have put forward. I did look it up a little bit. There's a R Skeptics subreddit. If you would like a fun read on the topic, you can go find out what people are doing over there. But I don't know. Well, so anyways, their idea is that it wouldn't be worth it to use this weapon because the penalties would outweigh any benefit. Never mind that there are plenty of cases of Cold War actions, such as surveillance using the SR-71 or satellites on our end, and I'm sure our enemies also have surveillance methods, hacking attempts, supplying the enemies of your enemy with weapons, spies being caught and killed in other countries, that kind of stuff. Nobody really wants another world war, so they play these cloak and dagger games. And I believe absolutely that an enemy, if they had such a weapon, would be more than willing to use it to, whatever end they were trying to achieve. Some of the assumptions here being made by skeptics are incorrect, right? So there were high-level people targeted, very high-level people targeted, not just peons, but high-level people experienced this. And they're making the assumption that it wouldn't be worth it to attack people. However, we did discuss that it would be worth it to sabotage, relations between two countries. It appears that that's what happened. If you take the narrative as at face value, we were there trying to improve things between us and Cuba, us and China, and other places, and our people were attacked in those places. Well, what better way to sabotage talks, right? And there was definitely some fallout from those attacks, especially in Cuba. So I don't want to spend too much time on the skeptical explanation, but there were a lot of people who came forward with symptoms, and there could be even more than we are aware of. The number is probably at least 1,500, possibly more than 2,000. We really don't know for sure. So it's hard to imagine that 2,000 people are stressed out, having hangovers, etc., and having severe chronic illnesses that follow these attacks. So another explanation is just simply mass hysteria. Everybody is in a state of fear and paranoia, and they're just freaking out over nothing. Again, the descriptions of the witnesses don't support this idea, but believe it or not, some people actually believe this. Another explanation, and I'm not joking about this one, cicadas. Yeah, cicadas, those little grasshopper-looking things. Only, creepier. They think that the cicadas are somehow causing this. I don't know. I don't know how to explain that, but those are some skeptical explanations. I don't want to spend too much time on it. The only way you could believe a skeptical explanation is if you, so these things can't both be true, right? It can't be all psychological, and the witnesses can't be telling the truth. One of those things is not true. So either the witnesses are all lying about their experiences and about their symptoms, or or they really are telling the truth, right? And then you can't have these skeptical explanations. So you could say that they're all lying, I suppose, but that doesn't seem likely to me. This seems credible, especially since you have doctors who have gone on the record and said that, yes, these people do have symptoms. We have found problems with their brains. All right, so some actual real things that could cause this. Exposure to pollution, chemicals, pesticides, or something else in the environment that could make these people sick. Unlikely. There aren't any known chemicals that could cause this cluster of symptoms, but it is something that has been considered. Secret weapon. That's probably the most widely accepted cause of the Havana Syndrome is some kind of secret weapon, probably EM weapon or a microwave weapon. It would unlikely to be China causing these attacks because it doesn't seem like China would have a whole lot to gain from attacking our diplomats, particularly ones that were trying to work with China to improve relations. China has a huge market in the United States. They have a lot to gain from being on friendly terms with us, not very much to gain from deteriorating relations. So, probably unlikely to be China. Cuba, possible, but given the worldwide nature of the attacks, seems unlikely that they would have such a far reach, although I think anything's possible. There are some other possible candidates, but let's be real, Russia is the most likely candidate, and we do have documents and investigations to support that. There have been a couple of things released through FOIA and whatnot supporting the idea of Russian use of these things. And we're already pretty much not friends with Russia, so if they get caught, it's not going to change anything. So they can deploy this weapon, and they won't get, if they get busted, doesn't matter. We're already not friends with them. You know? And it makes sense too, because deploying a non-lethal weapon like this that could disrupt things, make people ill, or make their family members ill, and make it hard for them to do their jobs is a much better idea than just killing people. If you just kill people, that's how wars start. But if you attack them with this mysterious, bizarre, and to some people unbelievable weapon, well, that's perfect. I mean, that makes a lot more sense. Another idea I didn't run across this idea anywhere. I'm sure I'm not the first person to think of it, but it occurred to me, what if this was done by our own government, the CIA or whoever, testing it to develop a weapon to see how well it works, to see what kind of effects it has on people, to see, does it work on children? Does it work on adults? Does it work differently on people of different size, on men, on women? They're developing a weapon and testing it on our own people. I've talked about on this show different occasions where our government has tested things on the population, including government employees before. So it's not outside the realm of possibility that they would do that again. Maybe not. I don't know. I don't have any evidence to support this idea, but it was just a thought that had occurred to me. And it's also possible. So we had this cluster of attacks from more or less 2016 to 2021 or 2022 seems to be when most of the attacks happened. There are some attacks that happened outside of that date range, but that seems to be the largest cluster of attacks. Now, if our government was developing a weapon, maybe they concluded their tests and decided either that it wasn't worth continuing the development or that it was time to deploy this weapon. If they had been using this from, let's say, 2022 until now overseas, let's say in Russia, Russia isn't going to be public about that because they wouldn't want to give us feedback on how well it's working or how well it's not working. I don't know. So these are some ideas that are going through my head when I'm reading this. I don't know. Is it possible? I guess. Is it completely ridiculous? Probably, but it was just an idea. So the weapon type, as I said before, is probably microwave or some other electromagnetic radiation. The reason microwaves are a good candidate is that microwaves can go through walls, glass, car doors, or whatever. They travel through things fairly easily, so they would make a good weapon, or they would be a good candidate for what people have experienced. People have experienced this outdoors as well as indoors. Park outside in a van, use some infrared to see who's inside or where they are, and zap them from, Tell the guy in the back of the van, zap away. They zap him, and then they drive off. Easy peasy, perfect crime, never get caught. Well, all right, that's all I've got on the Havana Syndrome. Thank you all so much for listening, and until next time, keep it strange.